This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is the season premiere of Decision 2012 on City Talk. The conventions are over, the platform's adopted, the nominations accepted, the speeches made. Bill Clinton, in his widely applauded address to the Democratic National Convention, declared, "We're all in this together." Are we? Or are we hopelessly divided? A nation both at odds and at each other's throats. Both parties can't even agree on basic facts, increasingly making them up, although one party seems to have a more severe Pinocchio problem than the other. The only thing they can seem to agree on is the paramount importance of this election, the 2012 presidential election. To examine the parallel universes that Republicans and Democrats seem to occupy and the different truths they espouse and mouth is Michael Cooper, national correspondent for the New York Times. Michael's Joni Mitchell +1, having reported on American government on 3 levels. New York City, where he covered the NYPD and then City Hall. New York State, where he was the Times Albany bureau chief, and now national politics. During the 2008 presidential election, he covered the McCain campaign, and afterwards he joined the national desk, where he has reported on President Obama's stimulus package and economic policy. Most recently, he has been the Times fact checker extraordinaire. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, you looked at these conventions, and one striking thing was the disregard for the truth.
That was something that caught a lot of people's eyes at this convention. I mean, neither campaign, and frankly no campaign, has ever had a sterling record when it comes to the truth. But at both conventions, there were a number of assertions that were either incomplete or incorrect or misleading, and so it kept us busy trying to keep the record straight.
Okay, in terms of my characterization of one of the parties having a longer nose as far as the untruths are concerned, the Republican Party seemed to have stretched the truth far more than the Democrats did, even though the Democrats were not without fault.
Right. We didn't do a strict tally or a comparison, and in fact, that could be a little more deceptively difficult than it looks at first blush to really figure this out. But certainly in the Republican convention, there were moments, for instance, the first night of the convention was dedicated to this idea of "you didn't build that," and they were seizing on comments that President Obama had made at a Virginia campaign stop when he was talking about infrastructure and the fact that, if you have a business, you benefit from roads or bridges, you didn't build that. And that became the theme of the first night. But what I found interesting watching it, on television is they selectively edited the audio tape of the president. So it made it sound like he was saying, "Let me tell you, if you have a business, you didn't build that." When in fact he said, "Let me tell you," when there were about 3 paragraphs of discussion. And he said, those roads and bridges, you didn't build that. But that was cut. So that was an interesting moment to me.
Yeah, I think one of the most outrageous quotes to come out of the convention was Neil Newhouse, the Romney campaign pollster, quote, "We're not going to let our campaign be dictated by fact checkers." So is there more lying and distortion now, or it only seems that way?
That's a good question. I mean, it may be that there's more disregard for fact checkers. I mean, what Neil Newhouse, the Romney campaign's pollster, was saying is that he thought that fact checkers brought their own sets of beliefs and issues to the table. He was basically questioning their impartiality.
Well, I mean, you're part of the mainstream media. You're part of the liberal Eastern elite. Come on, your facts have to be wrong.
I've heard that opinion in my reader email sometimes.
Oh, we have to talk. No, we have to talk about that. Go ahead.
But what it may also be that there are just more fact checkers around. I mean, I don't consider myself, strictly speaking, a fact checker.
Sure.
I'm just a reporter, and I'm trying to examine and evaluate things that officials and campaigns and candidates say. But that said, there are a number of good neutral arbiters who make a serious attempt at fact-checking these days. PolitiFact.com won the Pulitzer Prize after the last campaign, part of the Tampa Bay Times.
Yep.
factcheck.org, part of the Annenberg Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Washington Post has somebody called the fact checker. And so there are
all these establishment institutions that the people who might look at this disregard it.
Well, what I found interesting, and one of the themes that I touched on in some of my stories examining this, is the trust in the mainstream media is dropping precipitously. If you look at it from what it was in the 1970s to what it is today, people really don't trust it. So people who might have been neutral arbiters once, who might have had the power to say, this is wrong, and might have shamed a campaign into not saying it anymore, they're respected a little bit less. Also, because of all the online information, people can sort of have their own sets of facts now. I mean, there are sort of partisan groups that will fact check the fact checkers and try to put it in the most positive light for their guy one way or the other.
One of the interesting things that you cite a study by two political scientists that talk about a backfire effect, particularly among conservatives, that the more contrary information you give them, the more hardened they become in their incorrect beliefs.
Right. This was an interesting study, but they didn't look at separate fact check articles, but they looked in normal news accounts. If there's a misperception and the reporter tries to correct the misperception by marshaling an argument or a fact, they found that in many cases that didn't change people's idea of whether the misperception was true or not, and that in some cases there was this backfire effect because readers who were committed partisans on one side or the other would find themselves arguing against the correction, and they would solidify the underlying misperception.
So you have this almost perverse consequence of confirming people's false beliefs.
It seems like that can happen.
Now, what about, is there no penalty for this? Is there no shame?
Well, I think there is a tipping point, and no one is quite sure when it happens, when it gets out of the realm of evaluating a candidate's statements and it goes into the realm of evaluating the character of the candidate. And I think back to 2000, where, fairly or not, Al Gore got a reputation for playing fast and loose with the truth.
I invented the internet.
Or, did I go to Houston with James Lee Witt, the head of FEMA, or was it his assistant?
Right.
And the Bush campaign seized on that to try to question, call his credibility in question.
Nothing compared to now.
Right. But I'm saying that's the point where it becomes a problem. And I think you saw that a little bit with Representative Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney's running mate. He gave a speech at the Republican National Convention that was interesting. Fact check is the wrong word, but there were lots of things that were sort of misleading or incomplete at a minimum, right? He attacked the president for not acting on the Simpson Bowles deficit, commission's findings and recommendations without mentioning that he helped kill it.
Right.
There were
the
things
Medicare.
Like right. He attacked the president for cutting $716 billion in the growth of Medicare over the next decade without saying that his budget had counted on the same cut. So there were a number of things like that. And after that, those are policy issues that I think voters find hard to understand or to adjudicate sometimes. But what was probably more damaging among many voters was this thing that was just a silly thing where he was caught, bragging about his marathon time, and he said it was a mistake. It was 20 years ago. Who knows what happened? But those are the kind of things that I'm sure the Romney campaign is worried about. And you see the Democrats trying to act on it. The Democrats, Joe Biden has been traveling the country saying, fact check me, do this, do that.
Right.
They're trying to create, to draw a contrast here.
Okay. And the point, an interesting point that you're making is it may not be the policy/political Pinocchio, but rather the personal, like, why the hell are you lying about your time on the marathon? That may be, I think you've hit on something. Don't lie about your personal stuff, but you can lie about policy.
That may be true. And the fact is that both sides have done this. I talked about the out of context,
on both sides,
yeah. At the Democratic convention, it wasn't quite, there was no night theme of the convention to this, but quite a few of the speakers, got up on the platform and said, Mitt Romney, he's a guy who said, quote, I like to fire people. And that's also a very out of context quote from, an event where Mitt Romney was talking about healthcare choice and how he likes to be able to get rid of a healthcare provider and choose another one if they don't do well, so.
Okay, how do you go about fact checking? You're watching the speeches, and your job is to check the fact. How do you go about doing it? What's the process? Well,
this circles back to something we were talking about earlier, which is that in this day and age, campaigns are likely to repeat dubious assertions rather than stop once they're challenged. So first of all, I check to see what campaigns have been saying in the weeks and months before an event. And then I look to see, which things strike me as curious or questionable, and then I try to marshal the data. The other great thing, the internet may be a Tower of Babel for some things, but it also means that you can really go to the source material very easily. You can go to the Congressional Budget Office, you can go to the GAO, you can go to OMB. You can find the data that you need to sort of evaluate these claims quite quickly now.
Was there one claim that sort of you just said, what?
Well, it's hard to say if there's one thing, but a lot. I think what was surprising to a lot of people was when Congressman Ryan was speaking. He has such a reputation for being the straight shooter. This Wisconsin Midwestern budget wonk. And so when his speech had so many things to keep people like me busy all night, that was just an interesting moment. I mean, one of the most interesting things was, he had this claim about the Janesville GM plant.
Right.
And this was an interesting case because, every sentence he said discreetly was sort of true. Candidate Obama did visit the plant. He did say, if my policies are done, it should be open for 100 years. The plant is closed. But, he left out the fact that, the decision to close the plant was made when George W. Bush was president. And
you don't lie, you mislead.
The campaign since then has sort of pushed back saying, no, this wasn't false, this wasn't misleading. He's just saying that, the president should have saved a plant like this and he didn't save it. But that's an interesting claim to make too, because the president did bail out the auto industry. Billions of dollars were given to it. He did put billions of dollars into green energy, the kinds of things that saved places like Janesville. So it seemed like an unusual attack to make in such a high-profile speech.
Sort of bottom line, if the two sides can't even agree on the basic facts, how can they ever agree on the key issues that face the nation? I mean, they're really looking at two different realities. How do they talk to one another? Or are we doomed to gridlock?
Well, I don't see a lot of talking to one another these days. I don't know about you, but it did seem like, watching the conventions back to back, you did get that sort of parallel universe feeling a lot of the time.
Let's turn to the conventions themselves and the platforms. You examined the platform. In fact, one of the striking pieces was your comparison between the 2012 Republican platform and the 1980 Republican platform. You've got, between the Democrats and the Republicans, two competing visions and narratives, two starkly different philosophies, but also the Republican Party is not the party of 1980. It's not the party of Ronald Reagan.
Right. I mean, it was sort of striking. People think back to 1980 as a watershed for the conservative movement. And, at that time, the platform was considered a victory for conservatives within the party. But when I read that platform and compared it to the 2012 platform, the differences were just incredibly striking, both in policy and in tone and in substance.
What explains it?
Well, I think in those days you still had moderate Republicans, you still had Northeast Republicans. The Republican Party has increasingly become more of a Southern party, more of a conservative party. I mean, it's partly the success of the Reagan Revolution for conservatives. They wound up, so if you look at the 1980 platform, for instance, it's still anti-abortion, but it contains language saying we recognize that the country is divided and even our own party is divided.
Right.
Very different in tone. If you looked at the 1980 platform, it said, we don't believe anybody should be denied a job because they can't speak English. And of course, the 2012 platform is, English is the official language. And if you look at the 1980 platform, they talked about the supremacy of the car culture, but they also said, we recognize that cities need to have affordable and dependable mass transit, and that's good for energy conservation. And if you look at the 2012 platform, they kind of attack the Obama administration saying, instead of civil engineering, he's giving us social engineering that's going to, impart his dense urban vision on the rest of the country. So it's just a very different document.
Okay, let's look at the two platforms currently, the Republican and Democrat. I pulled out some of the contrast, both from your work and actually reading the platforms. Same-sex marriage, the Republican says, the platform says it's an assault on the foundation of our society. The Dems, we support marriage equality. The Republicans oppose gun legislation that would, quote, change the capacity of clips or magazines, while the Democrats say that there should be at least reasonable regulation. If you look at these two documents, whoever wins this election, 50%, and if it's one of the elections like 2000, more than 50% of the public is going to totally disagree with the founding documents of the administration.
And it's, you know, it's tempting. A lot of people write off the importance of platforms. I mean, most people outside of this room don't read platforms. You know, there's a question about how important are they really. You know, if you look at Republican candidates going back to Bob Dole, they've all supported exceptions to the abortion ban that were not in Republican platform.
Well, Bob Dole said that he didn't even, in 1996, didn't even read it.
Exactly. But that said, you know, I did speak to a political scientist at Rutgers, Jerry Pomper, who has done a lot of research on party platforms.
Absolutely.
And, you know, he looked at platforms over a series of decades and tried to identify, you know, what are the concrete pledges that aren't just sort of touchy-feely, gauzy statements. And, you know, once he identified them, he tried to see, well, what happened after the party won? And he found that about 70% of the time, parties at least try to implement their concrete pledges. So he makes an argument that people should pay attention to platforms.
Well, and clearly, the platforms provide weapons for the opposition as well.
Right. You saw that with the Democratic platform this year because, you know, things that were not in it.
Yep.
I mean, the Democrats took out a line that said, you know, we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which had been in for decades.
Right.
And they also took out the word God, even though there was a section about faith and religion and clergy. They had a line about God-given talents that somehow, you know, was lost. But, you know, when the Democrats had that, they had this sort of spectacle on the floor of the convention in Charlotte where they decided to alter the platform.
Yeah.
And you had, you know, poor Mayor Villaraigosa from Los Angeles trying to shepherd this through, and they tried to do it by a voice vote where you needed 2/3, and it seemed clear to anybody who listened that there were not 2/3 support, but he gavelled it.
And then you had the booing, etc., and the media, particularly the TV commentators, made a big deal out of that.
Right, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised. You know, I would expect that we'll be seeing that in a television commercial at some time in the near future.
So you were not in Tampa or Charlotte. You watched this like much as we did.
Right, which for me was sort of an epiphany because you know, I went to the 2008 convention, you know, in St. Paul when I was covering the McCain campaign, and in 2004 I went to both conventions, and so I've been going to conventions in person for a long time, and it was very interesting to experience it, watching it on television the way most people experience it, and in some ways I think it might have been even better than being there. You know, in the past, you know, it's always been good to be there because I like to buttonhole people, interview people. When I was doing more of the beat reporting type stuff, that was crucial. But the difference between watching on television and actually being there is the difference between, you know, going to a baseball game and watching a baseball game on television. You know, if you're in Yankee Stadium, you know, you feel the excitement, you hear the noises, you have the smells, but you can't always see the action up close, and you don't see it the way people at home see it. So it was just interesting to see. I mean, I get the sense, for instance, that, you know, one of the most famous or infamous moments of this convention was, you know, the Clint Eastwood speech in Tampa. You know, watching it on television, you could see that people in the hall mostly seemed to like it, although there was certainly some nervous tittering there. But there was also cheering and laughing. Whereas on television, the awkward pauses just seemed that much more awkward and slow, and you could sort of see why people reacted to it the way they wound up reacting.
So, I mean, were they different realities or just the sense of can you feel through the TV? Well, the way, you know, you described the being actually in the arena itself?
Well, that was something I was curious about because, you know, the arena sometimes goes crazy. I remember being in St. Paul when Sarah Palin spoke, and that was a real make or break moment for her. And, you know, the room went crazy, and I think people at home felt that. And I was just wondering what it would be like to watch things on television. And you could see some speeches falling flat and others.
For example?
Well, you know, I didn't feel a lot of energy in maybe like, you know, Governor Christie's keynote address, you know, to the Republicans, but you did feel a lot of energy when Condoleezza Rice spoke to the Republicans. And somehow, you know, through whatever strange alchemy, you know, it sort of comes through on the television set.
Where do you go next? What does Michael Cooper now do?
Well, my marching orders are to try to, you know, think about some of the big policy issues that are at stake in the campaign.
Policy.
And, you know, find ways to write about them that are, you know, make the broccoli a little tasty.
Ooh, ooh. You've written extensively on the stimulus and the impact of the stimulus on states. And in fact, the Times did a major front page piece in the magazine by Matt Bai about Ohio. Give me your sense of the relative success, again, you know, this is Mike Cooper, of the stimulus and perhaps the use of the stimulus as a campaign issue on both sides.
Right. Well, in terms of the success, did it do what it wanted to do? You can look at sort of neutral arbiters like the Congressional Budget Office, which every quarter does a report on what are the effects of the stimulus, which was called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act officially. And you can see from their reports that they give a range of what the effect was, but generally they say that around 2010, which was the height of spending of the stimulus, they credit it with creating between 1 and 3.94 million jobs, which is in the realm of what was promised.
Right.
So in that sense, is it a political sense? I think you can say absolutely not. And witness President Obama's speech at the convention where he mentioned the stimulus, pretty much not at all. I mean, there were some oblique references possibly to it. But otherwise, considering this was, one of the biggest bills of his 4 years, it kind of went unmentioned.
What about health care? Also unmentioned.
Healthcare also unmentioned. What was mentioned? The GM and the auto bailout.
Right.
So,
looking at the speeches of the two major party candidates, of Romney and Obama, what did you come out from the Obama speech? What was the message that you took away from the speech, both as an individual but also as an observer?
Well, I mean, I thought what was interesting about President Obama's speech was, he was trying to make the case for 4 more years, despite things not having come out as well as he'd hoped or promised, or people had thought, 4 years ago when there was such tremendous excitement. And so it was interesting to see him try to make the case, this is what I've done. The other guys would be worse. Bear with me, give us more time. I thought that was interesting. And because he had a much more sober tone, I think, the pundits reacted, much more lukewarm to it. It wasn't, people are used to the kind of soaring oratory from him. And this, I think, was consciously delivered in a much flatter, kind of more humble kind of sound
Yeah, and
way.
it also seemed almost as if they pulled a lot of the stuff out of focus groups. They had a real understanding of the multiple audiences he was talking about and cut back on the rhetoric.
Very possibly. And, with Governor Romney's speech, one of the things that I was struck by was, how personal it was, how much of it was about, his life. I'm from the middle of the century, in the middle of the country, and this is what it was like growing up, and sports team, and all these other things, which I think shows that, they're still laboring to overcome, what's this perceived likability gap that shows up in polls.
Right, and also it's almost like the beginning of a campaign when you do the positive bio stuff. This is the convention. Mm-hmm. Both speeches, though, were fairly devoid of substance.
Right.
And picking on Romney, his appearance on Meet the Press, I mean, he's ignoring substantive answers to questions.
Right. One of the things that gave us pause in trying to evaluate some of the statements of the Democratic National Convention is speaker after speaker kept saying, Mitt Romney will raise taxes on the middle class. And, in fact, Mitt Romney, in his speech at the convention and in his policy says, I promise not to raise taxes in the middle class. So we tried to unpack that a little bit. And at issue is his pledge. He wants to lower tax rates across the board by 20%. But he says he will do this in a revenue-neutral way, which would mean eliminating deductions for all kinds of things.
Sure.
But he doesn't specify which deductions. So a lot of economists, left, right, and center, as my colleagues reported today in the paper, Annie Lowry and David Koczynski,
Right.
have looked at these promises, the competing promises he's made, and say they don't see a way he can do this without somehow hurting the middle class. And interestingly, the speaker who I think made that case the most accurately was probably President Clinton, because he didn't say Mitt Romney will raise taxes in the middle class. He explained what the tension was and said, so to do this, either you're going to explode the deficit, or you're going to hit the middle class, or you're going to do this. He kind of laid out the options.
Clinton's sort of the high point of both conventions, both in terms of sort of just the brilliance of the speech as well as the connection he made. I mean, the pundits both left and right praised him.
Yeah, it was a very interesting speech, and it was. I think you've heard President Obama talking about how he wants to make him the secretary of explaining things. So.
Clinton could be a huge boost to the Obama campaign. I mean, if Bill Clinton gets on the stump and really campaigns vigorously, that could make the difference.
Maybe. He's going to be on the stump this week in Florida, I believe. Then again, he did an awful lot of campaigning 4 years ago, and
Right.
it didn't always make the difference then.
Right. And he didn't campaign, though, in 2000 because he was under the cloud from the Lewinsky thing. We'll have to see. As Donald Rumsfeld would say, we went through two of the known knowns, the conventions. We have now another known coming up, and those are the presidential debates. You've seen them in the past. You know what's going. What should we be looking for as viewers in those debates? How are you going to look at them?
Well, I mean, I'm going to look at them to see, how close to the truth and to the known facts to both of these guys hew. But I'm also going to be looking, to see what are the arguments. I mean, what's the compelling? Both of them have framed their campaigns so negatively. The Republicans are saying, vote for us because we're not him, and the president is saying, vote for me because I'm not them.
Right.
And I still would love to hear a little bit more with more specificity. What would each side do if they were to win, and what is their actual program going to be?
Well, and in part, that is a function and a result of the quality of the moderators and the questions and the follow-ups to those questions.
Right. I mean, like many people, I kind of lament the hyper-scripted affairs that debates are. We get 90 seconds for this and 30 seconds if this happens.
Debates. I mean, they're almost parallel events.
Right. I mean, my favorite moments are when they ignore the rules and talk to each other.
Right.
I think those are often the most enlightening moments.
That's exactly right. What do you expect? What do you see in terms of the country and its divisions? Are we hopelessly divided, as the convention seemed to suggest?
I mean, there's been a lot of research about polarization, and I think certainly our democratic institutions are hopelessly divided to some extent. I mean, people who look at the polarization of Congress, it seems to be as wide as it's ever been.
Well, in fact, the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican, which has never been the case before.
Right, didn't used to be the case. This is also a year of, we've just done redistricting. That usually tends to exacerbate to some extent polarization because people are drawn into safer and safer seats and they feel less, impetus to sort of placate the other side. So it'll be, interesting to see what happens here.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems that we're in parlous times with the outcome really unclear.
I think that's true.
You have to come back. My thanks to Michael Cooper for being on the show. Join us next week when my colleague Ronnie Eldridge and I co-host an hour conversation with political machas extraordinaire Bob Shrum and Ed Rollins here on CUNY TV. Wonderful, Michael.
Thanks,
excellent. Thank you. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.